Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction. I want to thank the National Institute for Cultural Heritage, the Cultural Heritage Administration of Korea, the City of Cheonju, and UNESCO ISHCAP for organizing and hosting the 2021 World Forum for Intangible Cultural Heritage. I offer special thanks to those representing the Secretariat for the ICH World Forum on the ground and the ICH World Forum technical team, who've made this complex business of participation look simple and problem-free when it's not. Sorry, why is this not, okay. Oh dear. Okay. As has been discussed, we've been in the midst of a new era of intangible cultural heritage for quite some time. Rapidly vanishing ways of life, globalization, climate change, political change, new communications technologies, and now a global pandemic are destroying, modifying, and creating cultural patterns, activities, and knowledge continuously. Although these processes have been ongoing since the first cultural expressions emerged early, the ancestry of humans, these have been accelerated over the past 2 centuries from gradual generational change to increasingly rapid change over increasingly small subgenerational cohorts. The impacts of these processes have expanded due to major changes in communication, which can spawn and nurture new forms of sociality and shared experience without spatial contiguity. So it has become increasingly imperative to not just collect descriptive and narrative accounts of and relating to ICH, but to further document ICH within its context of use and experience. To do this, we require a means of organizing our primary and secondary data so that we can situate it in its immediate and collective context of use and to relate it to other possibly related instances. Now, metadata is a relatively new term. It originated only in the 1960s for a very old human creation. The textbook definition of metadata is something like data about other data. In other words, metadata is documentation that describes data. It provides a framework within which effectively we interpret that data and sets the range of things that we can do with that data. Greenberg's 2003 functional definition of metadata is structured data that supports functions associated with a designated object. Without metadata, a record of behavior and even firsthand experience is not sufficient to capture cultural practices, knowledge, and skills. So effectively, ICH-based institutions and researchers have always applied metadata, just in not necessarily within the way the term is formally used. Now, metadata is often associated with libraries, museums, and customer databases, but it's a far more pervasive concept. Abstract classification based on perceived qualities of experience with objects and processes. Human language is the main means by which people describe and animate complex and detailed metadata about their lives and the world around them. Language reflects the juncture of bottom-up generation of behavior and presence phenomena, and top-down conceptual categories and relationships which are imposed on phenomena, which often invoke responses that modify the phenomena. The outcome is often an instance of ICH. Without explicit classification, learning is difficult and for many human domains, impossible. Centers of tangible heritage, such as museums or libraries, have metadata that is often oriented to describing and classifying individual objects. The abstract archetypical classification is more often, more or less, metadata, a connecting thread for a set of objects or a set of representations of objects. In documenting ICH, the archetype is the focal unit, and specific instances are given as examples that document the archetype rather than the instances being a focus of attention. Specific instantiated examples are needed, but these serve more as a kind of metadata related to the generic ICH. These are an instance of where tangible cultural heritage is concerned with things and the processes of their making is secondary. ICH focuses on doing things, ethnological processes, and specific instances are examples of ethnological archetypes. Thus, metadata in ICH is largely oriented to documenting processes for making things, whether tangible, such as a basket, or intangible, such as a marriage. This is more so in the digital age we now find ourselves inhabiting. Understanding tangible artifacts, such as a collection of emails, relies on understanding the cultural processes these are a product of. Now, as an example of the adaptive value of metadata, starting before there was metadata formally, the organization that I'm associated with, the Human Relation Area Files, and its parent, Yale's Institute of Human Relations, was one of the first attempts to curate ICH on a large scale organized for comparative research. The Institute of Human Relations was established in 1929 and created the Cross-Cultural Survey, which is a collection of ethnography organized for study on a page-by-page basis. In 1949, HRAF was founded to promote the Cross-Cultural Survey on a broader scale. Currently, the digital version of HRAF curates over 7,000 ethnographic documents covering 360 societies, with a total of around 1 million pages, and the pages themselves divided into about 4 million searchable units. Since its inception as the Cross-Cultural Survey in 1935, metadata has been applied to each page and paragraph by professional HRAF analysts. HRAF, like so many organizations sometimes referenced as memory institutions, is focused on reuse of information, not only its preservation. Now, originally, this was achieved through creating a large paper database, and with later replication of this in microfiche. I'm probably one of the few people remaining that has had the experience of using HRAF in all of its forms, with the paper version being the first form I encountered in 1970. And the basic organization of it was literally to produce for each piece of metadata, that varied key metadata, to create a copy of each page. there's a story that in the sort of ancestor of the cross-cultural survey by George Peter Murdoch, that he sort of started the project literally by, in the summer times, taking over sports halls and cutting up enough pieces of ethnography to, and so use the bleacher seats to effectively stadium seating to sort the material into seats by rows and columns, which was roughly how the original base was organized. Now, there are two key pieces of metadata that have been in the file since the beginning. A critical one is the outline of world cultures, the OWC, which provides a means of normalizing how we identify groups, the name for a group associated with a particular ethnographic document. In other words, there are, HRAF doesn't just collect one ethnography per society. There are dozens, in some cases hundreds of ethnographies on any given society. And the names used to refer to the people in them are widely varied. Sometimes they're colonial names, sometimes they're indigenous names, sometimes they're alternative indigenous names, sometimes they're the indigenous name of another group, labeling that group. Sometimes the names have taken a pejorative context. But these are all names that are used, and one of the ways of sort of normalizing so that we can look across even the body of literature for a people is to effectively have a list of all the names and then a preferred name on a per society, per culture basis. Although HRAF only deals with 360 societies, the OWC itself has many, many, many more ethnonyms. I wouldn't want to say it's complete by any means, but it is updated regularly. And so might be of great value to other providers and researchers of ICH. And on that basis, we will be releasing a public OWC service in the near future. The other critical metadata for the HRAF collection is the outline of cultural materials. Originally, a thesaurus developed for the cross-cultural survey with 755 terms organized into hierarchical groups. Each group is assigned a numeric label, and this is what is applied by the HRAF analysts to the text on a paragraph by paragraph basis. As an attribute of the text, the OCM indicates what kinds of ICH processes a given text refers to. And each of these terms is defined. These definitions themselves have changed over time to reflect changes in ethnographic knowledge. And there's a number of accommodations that have been made to sort of reconcile some of the differences between older material, because, in other words, material that was entered in the 1920s and 1930s, and that which has been entered more recently. Now, this is the form that the data originally took. Each page contains topical metadata associated with the text based on the outline of material cultures. In other words, what was applied was just the number. The rest of this is labeling for your benefit. And it also contained other metadata across the top of the page. This ensured basically that you could process each page independently of its position in a particular volume. This was, like I say, particularly in the early days of the files, unless you happen to go out and get a copy of the ethnography in particular that you were referencing in the library. All you had was individual pages out of a lot of ethnographies. In other words, you would search for, say, a particular OCM 361 in the filing cabinet. You go to the 361 drawer, and then you might look for particular ethnic groups through looking at the OWCs in the drawer, and literally just pull out the pages that corresponded to that society and that OCM. So what you had, then you detached the text from the volume. So we had to provide enough information to where you knew what you were dealing with in terms of the volume, and in case you wanted to, as you needed to keep track of the bibliographic details. Okay, so producing a digital version of this was a major challenge, and with 1 million original pages over 360 societies. HRAF has evolved along with information technology. Indeed, the onset of new technology, literally just in time, saved HRAF as an organization, as a resource. In the early 1980s, HRAF was booked to close within about 5 years by the board of directors. In other words, there just wasn't any more market for the microfiche collections, and they were fairly expensive, and it was anticipated they just simply run out of money, because HRAF is a self-supporting organization. It doesn't receive a subsidy from any source. The president at that time, Melvin Ember, convinced the board to mortgage the HRAF building, which is a fairly nice building in New Haven, next to the university campus, to computerize the collection. The board was still fairly dubious of this, and the entire enterprise might have failed except for the work and inspiration of Douglas Black, who was instrumental in directing and inventing the process in the transition. He didn't do it all single-handedly, but he was, in addition to Melvin, who was the believer but had no idea how to do it, Douglas Black figured out how to do it. Now, I mention this in part because Douglas retires from HRAF effective today and leave a considerable legacy for us. But as we can see through the timeline, we started with the technology that was available at the time. In 1989, there was no World Wide Web. Global networks were on a very piecemeal. And so the technology of choice at the time was CD-ROM, which is, to anyone probably under the age of 30 might wonder what a CD-ROM is. But as the web came into the picture, HRAF was fairly early on into utilizing that, and similarly, in terms of newer technologies we'll discuss in a minute, is now engaged in a process of renewing everything once again into a form which should be much more usable and importantly, much more of a foundation for use by other organizations. Now, in terms of adaptations, whereas in the original, in other words, the metadata and content have evolved in the digital eHRAF into this form. corresponding to, in this case, a HRAF-defined XML schema, a form suitable for digital search and display. XML is excellent for resources where you want to include metadata for the parts as well as the whole and integrate these into one data structure with metadata for the parts as well as the parts themselves often embedded within the whole. Whereas the original HRAF data set in paper and microfiche was fragmented into pages with duplicate pages for each key metadata value. The digital HRAF is normalized with a single instance of the text and metadata embedded within the document structure itself. Now, as we engage on our iClues project, which is an attempt to apply, develop more detailed metadata using machine learning, we are working with another form. This actually would never be seen by a person. This production, in other words, is for machine analysis, and the reference is always going to be then back to the XML version, which can be rendered into a near facsimile of the original document or document page or document section, such as you may want. Okay, now the main reasons for declaring a new era of intangible cultural heritage are a greater need due to pressure on much ICH, many new forms of ICH to document, and more relevance for potentially any archetype of ICH to deal with future challenges we will face. In the past, ICH has been largely documented and used by communities of experts who establish various roles in applying knowledge of ICH to current issues and problems. But this is an expensive and slow enterprise. For example, my organization, HRAF, which is self-supporting, requires a budget of around $2 million US per annum to grow, curate, and disseminate its collection. The direct cost of collecting and producing the content that we curate, the ethnographies themselves, over the past 2 centuries in today's dollars is conservatively probably in the neighborhood of $1 million. In other words, the direct cost, the overall cost, of course, being much, much more than that. So use of the current model of dissemination by experts is gravely underutilized, resources that could illuminate many other collections of both tangible and intangible cultural heritage, much less a world of health, economic, cultural, and environmental activity. So we combine new challenges in the curation and applications of ICH, and also new resources that may help meet these challenges, but which themselves create new forms of ICH. For my area, ethnography, the implications are enormous. Not only are new forms of social interaction, social institutions, and cultural paths forming online, but we can expect real-time data collection from these to monitor reaction and interaction with offline events, because the people on social media who attend these events reflect back on them. Again, in other words, it gives us a range of human interaction that we've never really had access before. There's, of course, a whole raft of ethical issues that relate to this. But it's increasingly becoming possible for any organization or indeed any person to apply primary ethnographic data collection and analysis to whatever they're doing. And this can be a powerful, beneficial, and dangerous possibility. So metadata is part of the solution to breaking away from primarily direct expert mediation of ICH collection, processing, and deployment to an approach where all of these functions can be performed by non-experts. The metadata is derived from existing experts, for at least nominally, metadata can represent the kinds of knowledge that experts possess about ICH, just as the development of solid metadata models for different ICH domains makes the domains more accessible to non-experts. But over the past 2 decades, there has been a revolution in the development of machine learning for classificatory metadata, computational linguistics for treating embedded language artifacts as metadata. Perhaps more critically, these computational tools can perform much better with the inclusion of expert-derived metadata, and with sufficient examples, computational models can be evolved that can make similar judgments of similar quality to new data. At least in this small degree, individual expert performances within a domain can be imparted to a computational model that can be applied to more material than the expert could ever process, effectively put the expertise into the hands of non-experts to deploy for their own purposes. And this can also be applied ethnographically to recording aspects of certain forms of ICH, such as farming knowledge, water resource knowledge, and musical knowledge, and indeed has been so. For instance, as an example, someone who's been very active in this area is Sakina Barwani at the Stockholm Environment Institute at Oxford. For the past 20 years, she's been applying a methodology where she collects expert data from individual sort of producers, whether they're small farmers, large farmers, local people conserving water conservation practices or whatever. So interacting directly with the performers of ICH to create new ICH data and metadata directly, rather than mediating between a performer and an expert such as an ethnographer. So Sakina's methodology maybe is done by doing a set of interviews. You collect initial judgments and then iteratively go over these rules with that same person as you identify inconsistencies in them. So in other words, it's a hybrid method. Most things will end up being, which is based around the idea of both applying machine learning to induce the initial set of rules, and then an iterative process that that is a trainable activity rather than one that requires deep expertise to refine them. Now, we don't have really time to go over the details of this, so I've just put a couple of slides together to give an idea of what's going on. Her results are achieved through a combination of machine learning to induce rules, iteratively working through them. This is a process which is sort of schematically given here, but it actually reflects a lot of what's going on in machine learning. Relatively simple algorithms have made great advances in a whole range of activities. Most of them revolve around not necessarily this one measure, TF, IDF, but relatively simple measures which are relate to the importance of a particular term, phrase, or otherwise in the text. And in other words, what you're looking for are things that are not too common or not too rare. They're just common enough to use as effectively a kind of metadata, but a more dynamic form of metadata rather than some kind of a fixed list. And there's, again, a range of extraordinary things that you can do there. There are other possibilities which are already being exploited. Cicana involves some aspects of this as well. The idea of being able to present a kind of simulation to people and have them comment on the simulation and end up with a simulation that then people without the experience and without the knowledge can take part in and be guided in being involved in the various activities concerned. And finally, we're going to have even more sources for this in the near future through something called the Internet of Things, which is already in play. Phones are probably the greatest viral carrier of these things at the moment, but soon the environments everywhere will increasingly be littered with sensors and transducers that both collect information and apply information of the environment. Machine learning and the derived metadata from this process will greatly influence how useful or unuseful the IoT will be and what we can make of it. So in conclusion, metadata will not solve every problem that ICH organizations encounter, but I would argue it will help address every challenge. Metadata facilitates the disaggregation and aggregation of material for different purposes to relate different cases, regardless of whether it's recording examples from a common tradition or, as in the case of HRAF, attempting to help researchers look across the range of human possibility. Thank you very much.